Welcome back to another video, and today I'm going to be explaining all of the possible connections between the main Spider-Man universes, which will include the MCU Amazing Spider-Man, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, the Spectacular Spider-Man, the Insomniac-verse, and from Into the Spider-Verse, Miles Morales, Peter B. Parker, and Gwen Stacy. And for this, I have a chart that will be at the top of the screen the whole video through. As you can see right now, it's completely blank, but as I go through each possible connection, there will be X's, or more so just colored boxes. The red will mean that there is no chance of that being a link. The orange will mean that there's a low chance, yellow will be medium chance, and then green will be high. And I'm basically just going to be going through each box and explaining every reason for. But if there's one that just doesn't make sense whatsoever and it's against it, that will have to be put as a red box, because it just, no matter how many reasons go for it, that one makes the whole connection impossible. And before I get into this, I do want to mention that I have spent over 124 hours on this video, which includes the time watching and playing the movies and video games, as well as the time I spent creating the script and editing and creating everything you see on the screen. Anyways, let's get straight into it. So I'm gonna X out the doubles because it's obvious. And we also know from Into the Spider-Verse that Miles Morales, Peter B. Parker, and Gwen Stacy are from separate universes, as well as the fact that Gwen Stacy is the only spider person in her universe, so she can't be linked to anyone. So Gwen Stacy from Into the Spider-Verse is completely out of the picture already. And I'm also going to be getting rid of the other doubles, which will be you see them change on the screen. Now, first up, we have the MCU and the Spectacular Spider-Man. And Liz Allen is the first real love interest for Peter Parker in Spider-Man Homecoming, but in Homecoming, it takes place when Peter is 15, and the Spectacular Spider-Man series takes place when Peter is 16, and we all know that Liz left at the end of Homecoming, so having her back in New York a year later just doesn't make sense, and considering Liz didn't know Peter very well at the beginning of the Spectacular Spider-Man series only further proves my point. Next up, we have the Spectacular Spider-Man and the Amazing Spider-Man, and in Spider-Man No Way Home, Andrew's Peter does mention that he's never fought a villain as cool as Tom and Tobey, and is amazed when Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man mentions having fought an alien from another planet, which would be Venom. And anyways, in the Spectacular Spider-Man series, Peter has numerous encounters with the Venom symbiote, meaning that Andrew Garfield and Josh Keaton's Spider-Man are not from the same universe. Next up, we have the Spectacular Spider-Man and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, and like I said earlier, there really only needs to be one solid reason as to why two universes aren't connected, and in this case, we have Peter meeting MJ for the first time when he's 16 years old in the Spectacular Spider-Man series. However, in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, Peter mentions having been neighbors with MJ since he was 6 years old. Next up, we have the Insomniac-verse and the MCU, and there are many similarities between these two, such as the Avengers Tower. This is the only other universe that we actually have mention of in Avengers. Could make sense that he had to make new friends, and that's how he ends up finding Mary Jane and Harry. I created a huge list for this one, and it wasn't until I watched No Way Home that all those reasons were just useless, because Aunt May dies in both of these series. In the Insomniac game, Aunt May breathes in the devil's breath, and later it infects her lungs and she does die. Whereas in No Way Home, Aunt May dies by the Green Goblin's glider. It just doesn't make sense. So these two, as unfortunate as it is, are not connected. Next up, we have the Insomniac-verse and both the Amazing Spider-Man and Raimi Spider-Man, and the simple answer here is that Norman Osborn died in the Amazing Spider-Man 2 as well as Spider-Man 1, whereas in the Insomniac-verse, which takes place when Peter is over 20 years old, Norman Osborn is still alive. Next up, we have the Insomniac-verse and the Spectacular Spider-Man, and the main reason here is that in the Insomniac game, which takes place years after the Spectacular Spider-Man, Otto Octavius is still normal. He hasn't been controlled by the tentacles or the thing, I can't remember what it's called, the thing he has on the back of his neck. But in the Spectacular Spider-Man, he does quite early on, so these ones are not linked either. Next up, we have Miles Morales from Into the Spider-Verse and the MCU, and Aunt May actually outlive Peter in Miles' universe from Into the Spider-Verse, which is not the case in the MCU. Next up, we have Miles Morales in both The Amazing Spider-Man and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. And in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, we see Norman Osborn die, not as a villain, but as a man who seemed to be half goblin. But at the beginning of Into the Spider-Verse, we hear Peter mention Norman's name when fighting the Goblin at the age of 26, which is way after the events of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And in this universe, we also see a 26-year-old Peter Parker die. And in No Way Home, both Andrew and Tobey Spider-Man return well past the age of 26, alive and healthy with the exception of Tobey's back. So, next up we have Miles Morales and the Spectacular Spider-Man, and in Into the Spider-Verse, we never got the chance to learn much about that universe's Peter Parker, but we do know that he was married to MJ, which means that the Peter Parker from the Spectacular Spider-Man series could still have gotten back together with MJ before his death, exactly 10 years after the show ended. And we also know that the Spectacular Spider-Man fought Doc Ock numerous times, but we never got a chance to see his daughter Olivia Octavius become a villain herself. This could mean that Olivia took it upon herself to live up to her father's legacy, but these are about the only supporting factors towards these two universes being linked. However, there also isn't any evidence against this theory, so for that I'm going to say there is a medium chance that these two universes are linked. Next up, we have Miles Morales and the Insomniac verse, and we have gotten to see Peter and Miles team up as Spider-Man in the Insomniac verse. However, in the Spider-Verse movie, Peter Parker was killed before Miles ever got the chance to don the suit. So next up we have Peter B. Parker and the MCU. And Tom Holland's Spider-Man has already had interactions with other Spider-Man, and he knows of the multiverse as seen in No Way Home, so he wouldn't have been as confused as Peter B. Parker to there being another Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Next up, we have Peter B. Parker and the Amazing Spider-Man, and as we all know, Gwen Stacy did die in the Amazing Spider-Man 2, and Peter B. Parker's origin story most definitely would have included that over his marriage troubles with MJ, so this connection is completely off the table. Next up, this is a big one. We have Peter B. Parker and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, and we do get to see the upside down MJ kiss in Peter B. Parker's backstory. We also get to see a comic strip containing both Spidey catching the train full of kids that the Green Goblin dropped in Spider-Man 1, and another one containing Doc Ock, as well as the fact that we know that they both had to bury Aunt May at some point, as heard in No Way Home and Into the Spider-Verse. They both have back issues. I don't know if that's just something that's bound to happen with Spider-Man coming of age, but they're the only two Spider-Men that we actually know have these back issues. You also have the divorce and the MJ troubles as mentioned in No Way Home, and obviously Peter B. Parker, well, they made that clear and we actually got to see them. And pretty much every scene in Peter B. Parker's origin story takes place during the evening, which is most commonly associated with Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man. And in No Way Home, Tobey's Spider-Man would be at about the age of 45, which is after Peter B. Parker was sent into Miles' universe, which explains why Tobey didn't seem nearly as surprised as Andrew upon entering a new universe and seeing other Spider-Men. And we also get to see a conversation between Tobey and Doc Ock in the final battle, in which Otto asks Peter how he's doing, and Peter replies with, "Trying to do better." Now take a moment to think about that. Don't you think that mindset would have been helpful in the Spider-Verse movie? I mean, who knows, maybe Miles taught the old man a thing or two during his stay on Earth 1610. And Sam Raimi's Spider-Man also gets a web lock in Spider-Man 2 due to stress, which seems to be something he's constantly surrounded by. Because of this, when Peter B. Parker gets into relationship troubles with MJ, he's forced to create his own web shooters if he wants to continue being Spider-Man, which explains why he had the shooters in Into the Spider-Verse. And then about 7 years later in No Way Home, Tobey's Peter has finally worked things out with MJ and is back to using his organic web shooters, which leaves this as a very high connection. So I'm going to put this as green because there are just so many reasons going for, and I haven't been able to think of one against. And so next up we have Peter B. Parker and the Spectacular Spider-Man. And once again, we don't know much about Peter B. Parker's past as Spider-Man, and in this case there's absolutely no evidence hinting towards the two universes being linked, but there also isn't anything that denies those chances. So although it is still possible, there is a very low chance, as there is a 30-year age gap between the two Peters. So I'm going to put this one as a low, which is the orange coloring. And lastly, we have Peter B. Parker in the Insomniac versus Spider-Man. And in the Insomniac verse, Peter is close friends with Miles. So when Peter B. Parker entered into Miles' universe, into the Spider-Verse, he would have definitely recognized the kid and would have been way more willing to help at the start. So these ones are not linked. And so finally, we have the final results. Each of these Earths were numbered at the beginning of the video, although I didn't mention it, it was displayed on the screen. And we do come to find that Earth 199999 is the MCU's Earth alone. Earth 616 is both the Raimi trilogy and Peter B. Parker's. Earth 1610 is the Spectacular Spider-Man and Into the Spider-Verse, the main one, which is Miles' universe. Earth 1048 is the Insomniac verse. Earth 120703 is the Amazing Spider-Man, and lastly, Earth 65 is Gwen Stacy / Spider-Gwen's universe. So anyways, I hope y'all enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to drop a like, subscribe if you're new, and comment down below if you found any flaws in my theory, or if you have any other ideas that could further prove my points. Anyways, I'll see y'all in the next one. I'm out.
I'm ballin' with injuries, Kevin Durant. I'll risk it all for all of the fans. We finna go ahead and run out some bands. So much potential they don't understand. Shorty, you supposed to be holding my hand. You were supposed to be part of the plan. Everything's different when you got a man. I might still go like your place on the ground. I swear that niggas be hating. They saying I can't make a banger. I did it again. Shut up, little Tucker. We finna live with the bros and go ahead and hop in the band.